Hi everyone, I'm Caroline. I'm the currently I am the secretary of the British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquariums Native Species Working Group, and I'm also the vice chair of the BIAZA Terrestrial Invertebrate Working Group. So that is kind of the context that I'm going to be speaking to you from today. I've been on both of those committees for about 11 years now. I've been working in zoos for a bit longer. I've worked in several different zoos in the UK in different areas and different sizes of zoological collection. And my passions are invertebrates, native species, conservation and education. So particularly how we engage the public with nature and how we encourage people to take conservation behaviours. I'm currently studying for a master's in interpretation, management and practice, looking at the theory behind how heritage interpretation works. So how we engage with audiences and how we help people learn. For me, zoological collections are a really important way of interpreting nature, and particularly engaging people with nature who maybe hadn't realised how interesting and fascinating the natural world is. For today's topic, I am talking about invertebrates in zoos. It's a very, very wide topic area, and there are actually a few things that I think you need to understand to be able to get to grips with the invertebrates we keep in zoos, why we have them, and some of the really exciting things that we are doing with them. So to start off with, I'm going to talk about what is a zoo. First, I just want to get a bit of an idea of our audience. So we actually have a poll function in the chat, and I just want to get a bit of an idea of who I'm talking to. So if we can get the poll, there's a couple of options there. You can pick which options apply to you. I think you can pick more than one. So you might sort of be studying and also working in collections or volunteering. So if you could give a click now, I can't see what you have put. So it's completely anonymous. The polls are always anonymous. So it just gives me a bit of an idea of who I'm speaking to, so I can make sure that I'm not talking that's things that you already know, or I'm not saying things that are sort of are using lots of acronyms that you won't recognize. Okay, we have one terrifying person in the audience who is either in licensing, so an inspector or a manager, who might well correct me on some of the licensing things. Hopefully not. Hopefully I've got it all right. But yeah, okay, I think that's great. Oh, yeah, we've just ended the poll, so just sharing the results there. So you can see it looks like an awful lot of you are studying related subjects, fairly high proportion. And hopefully, especially the stuff I'm covering at the beginning of this talk, should be really, really useful for you. So I'm just going to close that up. There we go. So starting off, I'm going to look at particularly kind of look at the history of zoos. I'm going to kind of introduce you to like when we start seeing invertebrates in zoos, and a bit about the legal aspects of exhibiting invertebrates on display. Then I'm going to focus particularly on what the Terrestrial Invertebrate Working Group do and what our members do through holding invertebrate collections, and what we do when we're collaborating with each other. This can generally be split into the three tenets of modern zoos, which are education, conservation and research. So that's where the talk's going to end up, talking about some of the really exciting stuff that's going on in zoos at the moment in those areas. So we're going to start with a quick history of zoos. We've been keeping exotic species in captivity for a very long time. I have a copy of the guidebook to the Tower Menagerie from the 18th century, when the collection belonged to George IV. And it begins with the line, "The origin of menageries dates from the most remote antiquity." So even then, zoos had started a very, very long time before. We actually have archaeological evidence of Egyptian menageries dating back about 5,500 years. There isn't a huge amount of evidence of invertebrates in these very early zoos, though. The Tower Menagerie Guidebook, for example, It does include a couple of reptile species, but it doesn't include any invertebrates. One of the oldest collections that's still open is Tiergarten Schönbrunn, which is the picture that has the elephant on it on the screen. It's over in Vienna. It was opened in 1752, and it was originally a Royal Menagerie collection. The Jardin des Plantes Zoological Collection opened in 1794. And rather than being a royal menagerie, so it was holding the animals that displayed the wealth of the aristocracy, the Jardin des Plantes Zoological Collection actually contained all of the animals that had been seized from the deposed aristocracy during the French Revolution. You don't really start seeing collections opening up that are more scientific and generally open to the public until a little bit later, where you get collections like London Zoo. So as part of the Zoological Society of London, they opened London Zoo. ZSL was established in 1826 and the zoo was established in 1828. And this reflects a pivot to scientific inquiry over aristocratic displays of wealth. So we start doing something a bit more interesting with our zoological collections here. There's some developments over in Germany with Tierpark Hagenbeck, where they start getting more naturalistic and educational exhibits. And later on, figures like Gerald Durrell, who opens Jersey Zoo in 1957, changes the focus of modern zoos towards conservation. And that's kind of where the foundations of what we're now doing start. In terms of invertebrates, though, these arrive very, very late in the history of the development of zoos. ZSL London did have a reptile house, and it was really famously redesigned by Jean Proctor in the 1920s. She came across from the Natural History Museum. But invertebrates as a sort of regular zoo exhibit didn't become popular until really quite recently when you consider the long history of zoos. Butterflies became a popular display in about the 1970s, and dedicated butterfly houses started opening in the 1980s. And that's probably the easiest thing to track. Stratford Butterfly Farm, which in non-COVID times is still open, you can still visit it today. It was opened in 1985 and it supplies an awful lot of the pupae to butterfly houses across the UK. Invertebrate sections and even dedicated invertebrate zoos started to appear globally from about the 1980s, with most of them appearing in the 1990s or the noughties even. So they are still something of a rarity. Invertebrates in zoos are often managed by keepers that look after other ectotherms, so reptiles and amphibians, occasionally the aquarium staff, or they might be managed by the education staff, which is something that's quite significant and will make a lot more sense when I start talking about how we use invertebrates in education in zoos a bit later. I don't think it's surprising that invertebrates have become a lot more common in zoos, though, as the husbandry knowledge required to keep ectotherms more successfully has developed an awful lot in recent years. If you're working with invertebrates, the husbandry knowledge that you have about how to look after them properly just keeps updating, it keeps increasing. So it does make sense that we're able to keep a lot more of them now. And also, I think invertebrates are incredibly effective at achieving the aims of a modern zoo. So the things that we have more recently set ourselves to do with our zoological collections, invertebrates can have a huge impact on this conservation, research and education output that we're setting ourselves the challenge to meet. I just don't think you can teach about or conserve biodiversity without including our most biodiverse group. But I haven't actually answered the question of what a zoo is yet, not in the legal sense. So you'll notice in the poll earlier, I included aquariums. It is quite a relevant point as there is a very specific definition of what a zoo is in UK law, and so few people are aware of this. But it's actually just about being open to the public and exhibiting animals that are not normally domesticated. So you could be a safari park, a sanctuary, whatever you want to call yourself. If you have wild animals and you invite the public to see them for more than 7 days a year, you're probably a zoo. There are some exceptions, pet shops, circuses, and examples where there's a very small display of animals, like a fish tank in a restaurant. But in general, there are some very, very specific guidance, and it applies to an awful lot more of the collections than you would expect it to. So, bit of fun. I have another poll now. You have to have a zoo license to operate a zoo in the UK. So I want to ask you, which of the animals up on the screen, which ones do you think you need to have a zoo license to have on display? So have a go, jump in the poll. Cannot see your answers. You can choose as many options as you want. We've got a few. Coming in. It's very interesting. I will say there aren't necessarily absolute right answers here. So, and as I said, it's anonymous, so just have a go. Right. I'll give you a little bit longer there. Oh, this is quite interesting. Brilliant. That looks like that's about everybody. So I'll end the poll. Oh, there was sudden late entry there. And hopefully you can see the results up on your screen as to what you guys think. Interestingly, our jungle nymph stick insect is by far the one that you guys are absolutely certain you need to have a zoo license to have. Actually, I will move on to our next slide because that's the answers. And I will give you a reference for this in a minute. There is actually a guide to the Act's provisions for the Zoo License Act that gives you examples of which species you need a zoo license to have or not have. And it does specify things like chinchillas are so commonly kept as pets, you don't require a zoo license. Peacocks just get everywhere and you can't stop them. So I'm assuming that's why they're in that category. But things like reindeer and wild boar, you do need a zoo license for. And the one that is really interesting for me is giant African land snails. Giant African land snails are specified in the guide to the Act's provisions that you require a zoo license to display them to the public, which I think sets a precedent that invertebrates are considered to be not domesticated, not that commonly kept in the UK, so they do require a license. I have put a question mark on bearded dragons and our stick insect example there as well, though, because they're not listed in the examples, and that means it is to a certain extent up to the local authority who run the zoo license. But in practice, it probably means that if you are displaying invertebrates to the public and they are not normally domesticated in the UK, then you would need a zoo license in order to operate. And that puts an awful lot of structure and rules as to how you can manage them. Now, the really, really relevant thing about if you have a zoo license is that you're going to get inspected based on the Secretary of State standards of modern zoo practice. And this is really important because in the UK, how you look after your pets, for example, is governed by the Animal Welfare Act, which tells you that you have to ensure that the 5 provisions, which used to be the 5 freedoms, are available. So things like they have to have food and water, appropriate healthcare, so taking them to the vet, and things like that. Now, normally, the Animal Welfare Act doesn't apply to invertebrates unless they're cephalopods. So if you're an octopus, then you're fine. But apart from that, it doesn't usually apply to invertebrates. But the standards for zoo licensing still include the 5 provisions, and it covers all species under the license. So zoos arguably have a legal imperative to meet higher standards of welfare for their invertebrates than someone who's just keeping one as a pet. And this is why when I'm talking later about the research that the Terrestrial Invertebrate Working Group members are doing, some of that is really cutting edge in terms of ensuring really, really good welfare and management of our invertebrates. So there is some very interesting stuff that's going on, and possibly it is prompted to a certain extent by the fact that we just have to meet higher legal standards. So I am a member of the steering committee for the British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquariums Terrestrial Invertebrate Working Group. We do tend to use lots of acronyms in BIAZA in particular, and because this one shortens to TWIG, we tend to call ourselves Twig, just because it's easier. So BIAZA itself is the Association of British and Irish Zoos and Aquaria. It's the professional body representing the best zoos and aquariums in Britain and Ireland. There are over 100 zoo and aquarium members. About 30 million people usually visit BIAZA collections every year. So that's about 1 in 3 of the population, obviously giving us a massive, massive opportunity for education. BIAZA itself is also a member of the World Zoo Association of Zoos and Aquariums, which is WAZA, and also the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria, which will be interesting later because they run some of the conservation programs. The Terrestrial Invertebrate Working Group is a group of people. I have got a picture of them. So that's our logo. It's a steering committee that is made up of volunteers from BIAZA member collections. And there are some external members as well, particularly vets and some other specialists. Members of the Zoo Association can come to us and they come to training events and networking events like our annual conference, and they can contact the committee for advice, get involved with events, or make use of the resources that we provide. We have a lot of different subgroups in the committee who focus on particular areas of interest. So this includes education, research, invertebrate health with our veterinary advisors, native invertebrate conservation, and there is even a hazardous invertebrate subgroup. And they create best practice for and support for dealing with venomous and other high-risk invertebrates. You would be surprised the number of zookeepers who have arrived at work to find an unmarked box with a black widow spider sitting on their doorstep. So one of the things the Hazardous Invertebrate Working Group subgroup does is they produce the kind of support materials for someone has thrown a Latrodectus at you. What do you do? And obviously that is very, very useful to members. We also have focus groups to address particular topics like sustainability. Many of our invertebrates in UK collections nowadays, they're from long-term captive bred stock, so they're not coming from the wild. But there are a couple of notable exceptions. Most Lepidoptera, so butterflies and moths, a lot of species, the breeding isn't sustainable at the required levels to run a butterfly house in the UK. And also leafcutter ants, who just don't generally breed in captivity yet. There's always research potential. Butterfly houses can help support in situ conservation if the pupae are sourced well. So it can have a positive impact on environmental stewardship, but it's something that you have to think about and be very careful of the ethics of it. And leafcutter ant colonies in zoos are typically removed as part of routine pest control in their native countries. But we do need to consider the ethics of that, and that's why we have subgroups working on things like that. What type of invertebrates do you typically see in zoos? After that, we're going to talk a little bit about why. So we have the chat. I thought it'd be fun for you guys just to chuck some answers into the chat and give us some ideas. So please write in the chat now what species of invertebrate, or at least what group of invertebrates, you think is the most commonly kept terrestrial invertebrate in UK zoos. And I'm just going to have a look at the chat, see if we've got anything. Oh, we have got, oh, yeah, an interesting question there that I will answer later. Cockroaches, spiders, Coleoptera. Oh, love the beetles. Spiders again, spiders again. Oh, butterflies. Okay, this is very nice. You've got a very, very good handle on sort of generally the kind of species we see. I love the cockroaches because they won't stop breeding answer. Oh, parchula snails. Very nice. You are going to hear about parchula snails later because I love them. I cannot stop talking about them. Crickets everywhere. I like that one. Oh, Kieran, you are right. It should be earthworms. That's your challenge to change. Right. So I went on the zoological record keeping system to try and find out the answer to this. Yeah, here you go. The system that the data came from is called the Zoological Information Management System, or ZIMS. It used to be run by a company called the International Species Information System, but they've recently rebranded as Species 360. If you're quick with acronyms, you may have realized why they recently rebranded, especially when zoos were trying to send money abroad to their record keeping systems and their banks put a stop on international transfers to ISIS. So they did have a big rebrand a few years ago, and it's now Species 360 who manage ZIMS. So the data isn't perfect, as not all zoos are on ZIMS and not all zoos log their invertebrates on ZIMS, but the results showed this. The top species, whoever said cockroaches, well done. It is indeed cockroaches. They just about pip giant African land snails to the post. You then get things like spiders, and the most common actual species is the chili rose spider. But you can see things like butterflies and moths. There's only 9 collections who are recording them at the moment. That might be impacted by the time of year, because a lot of places don't have their butterfly houses open over the winter. So that would probably go up in the season. I do say this though, it is possible that all of these species are blown out of the water by crickets. Whoever said crickets, you're probably right. That's because crickets are used as a feeder insect, so they're used as a food type for a lot of both our invertebrate predators and our sort of reptiles, and other sort of mammals, for example, will have them as well. So probably there are more crickets than anything else in zoos, or possibly mealworms, but they won't be logged on ZIMS, the Zoological Information Management System. Just to put this into context and to show how important invertebrates are as a commonly represented species in our zoos, there are actually only 88 collections that record having meerkats. So yes, it's more than hissing cockroaches, but it really isn't much more. And meerkats are an absolutely ubiquitous species in zoos nowadays. Ring-tailed lemurs has 70, so there are fewer collections holding ring-tailed lemurs than there are holding hissing cockroaches, holding cockroaches in general. 51 collections have big cats, and only 12 have elephants. So I would argue that cockroaches are a much better representative species of zoological collections in the UK than an elephant. And really, if the sign, when you get the roadway signs, the picture is supposed to be an elephant for zoos, surely it should be cockroaches by now. So why do we have these species? Well, most of the species that you can see on this list, they are there for education purposes, with the option of research projects because we're coordinated. A lot of these species, they're IUCN data deficient, or they're not assessed, mostly because invertebrates just have fewer data in general, so it's much harder to assess them on the IUCN Red List. But keeping these as kind of easy to manage, easy to keep species allows us to collaborate. For endangered species, which I will come on to later, it means that we can manage stub books for them. We have care sheets with recommendations for best practice, which is much easier when you're producing them for fewer species. And we can also have sort of support each other in our husbandry, and occasionally have an impact with some specific conservation efforts. So moving on to what we do with our invertebrates. First of all, education. Education is my passion, and looking at the species list of what's most commonly kept, that's what a lot of the species that were on that list are used primarily for. So I think education is probably the place to start. Oh, there we go. This is a famous quote by the Senegalese conservationist Baba Diop. Actually, this model of conservation education has been challenged. Researchers have found that we can conserve things we aren't taught about, but deepening understanding and are encouraging people to learn, respect, and perhaps even learn to love species is one of the tools that we use to try and engage people in conservation behaviours. In recent years, there have been a couple of really interesting research projects. One looked at 5 zoos in the USA and showed that anthropomorphism of uncharismatic species such as invertebrates on social media zoo pages was effective at increasing engagement. This is something that real life animals can do. For my diploma, I conducted a research project on the impact of the presence and handling of a live cockroach in education sessions in comparison to seeing an image of one. I found that a range of increased learning outcomes, including empathy markers, when one of the live cockroaches was present in the class. So basically, the kids learned more and cared more when there was a live cockroach there. And the cockroach on the screen is called Charlie because all of my cockroaches are called Charlie or Charlotte, depending on whether they're male or female. Much more recently, there was a study conducted at Flamingoland that found that zoo audiences watching a live animal show demonstrated significantly higher animal knowledge post-show compared to pre-show. So we know that these animals in our zoological collections can help people to engage more with nature, and it can help reaching out to hearts, minds, and ultimately, hopefully, behaviours. Within BIAZA, we share best practice for education. There are regional education meetings, national educators and presenters conferences, and one of our Terrestrial Invertebrate Working Group meetings was even themed around education with invertebrates. Probably our most well-known and absolutely awesome outputs as a working group, just everything we've done, is the Big Bug Bonanza. And this has been going on for about a decade now. It was developed at a conference in Reese Heath many years ago. And as they sing in Hamilton, I was in the room where it happened. I can remember sitting around the conference table and we came up with the Big Bug Bonanza. We were looking for something during the alternate year to National Insect Week because we don't just want to talk about insects every other year, we want to talk about insects all the time. And I actually designed the first logo. It was awful. It was truly awful. This new logo that's on the screen at the moment is much, 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 much better. A lady called Tracy Dove from the Isle of Wight Zoo has been the absolute powerhouse behind kind of getting this really to the levels it's got to in the last 10 years. She is amazing. It has won awards. It has involvement from BIAZA member collections across the country. And most importantly, it has helped to engage hundreds, perhaps thousands of visitors, especially children, with the amazing world of invertebrates. So watch out for the Big Bug Bonanza during the first week in August in your local zoos. This isn't the only education output that the Terrestrial Invertebrate Working Group has, though. We also produce things like position statements, which can help our members to respond to arising situations or address tricky ethical issues. Zoological collections are one of the main nature experiences that most members of the public engage with at some point in their lives. And this means that they then think of us whenever they have difficult questions. Just every time they've got a question, they come to us. And so the first time when I actually drafted the first Terrestrial Invertebrate Working Group position statement on the false widow spider to share with our membership, it came after I had a really lengthy phone call with a random woman who had phoned the zoo to tell me that the evil spider in her house was going to kill her children. And so we thought it was really important that our membership had the right information so that when people were phoning up the zoo to find out all about false widows because they were worried, that our members would be able to tell them the right thing and point them in the right direction to get further information if they wanted it. But we don't just persuade people that spiders are bad. Sometimes we actually save the spiders ourselves. So moving on to our conservation outputs. One of my favorite conservation stories, somebody put it in the chat earlier. It's the Bartula snail. I love them. They're just brilliant. Here's one. This was sent to me by Mark, who works with them. If you're not familiar with these little snails, essentially, the story of what happened is that humans introduced the giant African land snail to the islands of French Polynesia because, you know, French Polynesia, and giant African land snails are also known as the edible land snail. And so they're giant and apparently yummy if you like to eat snails. And they went down about as well as any species would, where you introduce a hermaphroditic species which produces thousands of eggs pretty much constantly and is primarily herbivorous, with no natural predators, and you just dump it in a gorgeous rainforest. Plant-based carnage. So then they brought in the rosy wolf snail to eat the giant African land snails. If you weren't previously aware that there are carnivorous snails that eat other snails, now you are. And there are videos of this on YouTube, but don't watch them on a full stomach. They are amazing though. So something to do after. Anyway, so the rosy wolf snails, unfortunately, they really didn't do that much about the whole giant African land snail problem. But what they did do was eat the tiny, beautiful, native parchula snails. Of the 125 Polynesian tree snails that used to exist, over half of them are now no longer found in the wild, and the majority of those are extinct entirely. But there are 24 species managed by an endangered species programme in zoos, with the European Studbook managed by Paul Pierce-Kelly at ZSL London. And some snails, some parchula snails, have been bred in zoos in the UK and returned to reserves in the wild. Talking of snails, I also saw a great presentation a couple of years ago by Tamas Pap, who works at Chester Zoo, about their Bermuda snail program. You have to see the presentation. If you ever get Tamas to talk to you about it, he's amazing. But basically, their snail breeding program turned into the Star Trek episode with the tribbles. So they brought in some Bermuda snails, which are critically endangered in the wild, and within a couple of years, they had 4,000 snails to release back into the wild, by which point they were, in fact, quite desperate to release the snails back into the wild. But it does show how these kind of departments, you know, getting involved in these efforts, when you've got the husbandry skills to be able to breed and look after these species, you can have a massive, massive impact. Endangered species are managed at a European level. So it's the whole of Europe working together, and that's done by the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria. And for a long time, there were actually only two invertebrate EEPs, which are the endangered species programs. It was the parchula snails and the frigate beetles. And now there are actually 6, so massive increase. And that is largely due to the work of Mark Bushell, who's the curator of invertebrates at Bristol Zoo, and the European Zoo Association's chair of TITAG, which is the Terrestrial Invertebrate Working Group equivalent at the European level. One that I have personally worked with is the Desertas wolf spider. Mark is the studbook keeper for this species, and Bristol was the first collection to keep them in the UK. Mark himself went out to Desertas grande, which is where they're found, and he went there in order to collect the founder population that started off the studbook. Because of the topography of the island, it is basically, it's like juts out of the sea, it's a cliff, and then you've got where the snails live on the top of the cliffs. So in order to start the studbook, Mark had to abseil down a sheer cliff into a boat carrying a rucksack of some very angry spiders. So it can be quite an interesting job starting up these studbooks. That is probably the most difficult founder population collection for an endangered species program. But yeah, that's a really great program, and it's still going on at the moment. It's quite a recent studbook, but they have been really successful in breeding the Desertas spiders in the UK. Then we have something that's a lot closer to home. I'm aware BioLinks is most interested in native species, so here is one. This is the fen raft spider. This is a project that I participated in myself for 3 years. By the final year I was doing it, we had 10 BIAZA members involved. The people on the screen, the top photo is me many years ago, looking very excited to have my first lot of spiders. Underneath is Karen Entwistle, who's at Chester Zoo, and Keith Russell, who was at Chessington at the time. The project was led by Helen Smith of the British Arachnological Society, who was doing it herself even before the zoos got involved. So she was leading it all up, and she was absolutely amazing. And it was coordinated for the zoo involvement by Ian Hughes, who is one of the most inspiring native species conservationists in the UK that I have ever met. He now has a company called Lifeforms Art, and he does a lot of nature illustration. So look him up. He's so cool. Essentially, what we did was rear hundreds of baby spiders. We'd collect, Helen would collect the spiders when they had their nursery webs, they'd hatch out. Then after they'd hatched, when they were ready, she'd go put mums back in the wild. And then the baby spiders would each be popped in a little test tube like this, and then sent around the country to be looked after. And we could then increase the survival rate up to, we had survival rates of up to about 95%, I think even 96% might have been my best survival rate. So we really, really increased the survival rates. And then they'd go back into the wild come autumn in good time to sort of be prepared for winter. Essentially, this happened sometimes in our zoos if we had the quarantine facilities there. But at one point, I had several hundred spiderlings in my spare bedroom that were just every couple of days getting fed a fruit fly for each individual test tube. I did used to, at the time, like dream of spiders, but it was good dreams. There is another project that's been going on recently that is really amazing with a native species on the Isle of Wight. It's something that Tracy Dove has been working on, who's one of our committee members. We received a request from Butterfly Conservation for assistance in conserving the Reddish buff moth. The only known UK population of this moth is at a single location on the Isle of Wight. So the BIAZA institutions on the island, which is the Wild Heart Trust and Amazon World, and they now work out in the field alongside Hampshire and the Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust to conserve the species. The main focus of their activities is surveying for larvae. This is carried out in early summer using a technique known as vacuum sampling. This is what is in the picture. So basically, they get a petrol-driven leaf blower, run it in reverse, so it's sucking up instead of blowing, and they pop a mesh over the end of it to catch any invertebrates that are sucked up, so they're not actually sucked up into the leaf blower. And it essentially, it's called a giant pooter. It is like a giant pooter on steroids. It's the auto pooter, and it is really, really fun to have a go on these. And if you've ever done spider sampling, they get used for spider sampling as well, so you might be aware of them. They are one of my favorite bits of equipment. They're so cool. The zoo team also assists the Wildlife Trust with light trapping for adults during spring, and habitat management work during the winter months as well. So I have covered education and conservation. Next up, we move on to research. So one of the big things that we can do as a community is share our knowledge. Our education focus group started a push about a decade ago to produce care sheets for all of the commonly kept invertebrates in zoos, with the idea that collections could refer to these as best practice guidelines for their own collections, but also if they were advising teachers on classroom pets, or if we had kids in the zoo who were just certain we're going to be the next Erica McAllister, and they just needed a bit of husbandry support in looking after their invertebrate collections. I have given advice recently. I'm sharing this photo. He hasn't given me permission, but it's really funny. I got in touch with this chap, who's photographed here, on supporting him to move a large established ant colony to a new setup. Now, anyone who has ever been bitten by a single soldier ant of the commonly kept species Atacephalotes, you will know that this is no mean feat. Like, one is bad enough. If you try and move the colony, they are all out to get you. And so I ended up getting sent this photo. This guy in his white coverall with his rubber gloves and the duct tape, he's doused in clove oil, and that what he's got in his hands is a bottle of baby oil, because apparently that stops them from climbing over you. But it did work. So this is the kind of thing that we can help with. When we can talk to each other, we can all share our tips on how to do things more safely. And in this instance, it actually saved the colony. So it was a really brilliant thing to be able to help somebody with. Our veterinary advisors also do some incredible work. These are some photos of Benjamin Kennedy, who is a member of the Veterinary Invertebrate Society, and he's attended several of the Invertebrate Working Group conferences and has helped out members. Definitely me, possibly mostly me. These are some images of species that he's worked with me. So you have a live praying mantis that is under anaesthetic, and it was anaesthetized with isoflurane, I think, and it's being examined under a microscope to investigate dark spot in the eye, looking for potential options as to how to treat it and monitor it. When I work with Desertas spiders, you can see an image under the microscope there, and then you can actually see him sort of anaesthetizing one under the microscope, and an image of the anaesthetic just being held just above the book lungs there. So he came up to work with us because we had some issues with a mysterious, what turned out to be a fungal infection. He anaesthetized them. He actually used sevoflurane, which I don't think he would recommend again because they came round quite quickly and they are quite active, jumpy, aggressive spiders. So ideally they want to be under for a little bit longer. And because of this, we actually even developed treatment protocols. So we were able to develop protocols to syringe feed honey water to the spiders in order to try and sort of build up their energy levels. And that's something he's used in mantids before. And we also delivered oral medication. And one of my favorite things was there were different medications that we tried. And Baytril is a really commonly used medication in zoos. And we use it for all types of different species. But it is well known that apparently it does not taste very nice. And one of the things that I really, really loved was when we tried to medicate a spider, giving them an oral dose of Baytril, and they absolutely hated it. And then they like stuck their head into the soil to try and wipe it off. It was just like this tiny little spider going like, yucky, yucky, horrible medication. But we were able to deliver some other medication orally, and that was brilliant to be able to medicate spiders like that. The International Zoo Veterinary Group, who work with a lot of UK zoos, provided an X-ray of a giant African land snail from Askin Bryan College that was useful in a paper on kind of the aging in these species. And Benjamin and Sarah Pellet, who is one of our veterinary advisors for the working group, and they contributed to the inclusion of invertebrates in a book on geriatric medicine for exotic species, which is so groundbreaking that people are really starting to think about our invertebrates and what we can do to support them, rather than just deciding, oh, it's an old invertebrate, just get rid of it. Actually thinking about how we can extend their life and support them to have a better quality of life as they age. Marie Kubiak, who is another of our veterinary advisors, has recently published the Handbook of Exotic Pet Medicine, and Sarah, again, and also Steve Trim of Venom Tech, who's another of our committee members, and they have contributed with articles on invertebrates. So again, trying to get the idea that actually these are living creatures and we can ensure that we're doing the best for them in terms of husbandry, including veterinary care and healthcare. The Invertebrate Health Focus Group has also produced invertebrate euthanasia guidelines, which kind of the request for it actually came from the working group to kind of combat this prevalent issue, which we were getting a lot of questions about, sort of dealing with pet owners who had sort of far more giant African land snails than they wanted, or stick insects everywhere, and people were being told to just put large invertebrates in the freezer to euthanize them. We think it's possible that they can experience the ice crystals forming inside their own bodies, so that is probably a very unpleasant way to euthanize a large invertebrate. So we came up with these guidelines from our veterinary advisors about how to do that in an appropriate way that actually is euthanasia. We have also been working with the incredible Frances Baines, author of the UV Guide, which is familiar to a lot of reptile and amphibian owners. She's been working with us for years and years and years, looking at research projects to improve our understanding of the impact of UV light in invertebrate husbandry. As Frances often says, we just don't know anything about the UV needs of many of our commonly kept invertebrates. And this year has finally seen a paper, which is up on the screen, that Steve Trim from Venom Tech and his partner Carol and Francis have been working on the impact of UV light on arachnids. And it's actually found that although a lot of pet keepers are providing full spectrum lighting for their arachnids, it might be quite stressful for them. So we do need to think about and study what we're doing to make sure that we're doing the right thing. And that's where that research aspect comes in. And there are loads and loads of other things, but I think I'm probably like over time now. So there's an awful lot more to do as well. There's lots of new projects that are up on the horizon. I think invertebrates are the most exciting group to work with in zoological collections and in general, because there's just so much to learn and they're so diverse and they're really surprising. So thank you very much for listening. And I think that makes it time for questions.
Thank you for a fascinating talk, Caroline. That was a whirlwind tour of the sector when it comes to invertebrates. A lot to take in. So we've had quite a few questions. If anybody, I'm going to give people a chance to jump the queue. If you put your hand up, I might ask you to just stop sharing your screen, Caroline, if that's okay. If you put your hand up, you can skip the queue. Otherwise, we'll take a couple of questions from the chat. I'm aware of time, so we will only have time for a couple of questions. So yeah, if you've got a burning question, you need to raise that hand. Okay, so if I come to, have we got any questions from the chat? Do you want to read one out?
Yes, we've got a few. The first one would be, why do you think invertebrates are a bit of a rarity in zoos?
I think they're increasingly less of a rarity in zoos, but I think that there is a real problem with the sort of perception that members of the public have of sort of what is a zoo. I do occasionally hear people kind of going, oh, you know, if it's not got elephants, it's not a real zoo. Which if you're paying attention to the licensing, yes, it is. But I think some of it is the kind of historic perception, and it is just going to take some time to shift across. I think it is also, historically, it might be a bit to do with kind of marketing departments in zoos. And I think that there is a change here, but we're dealing with sort of the historical marketing in zoos where people would pick the charismatic megafauna. And all they would ever share on their, you know, their social media or their print media was like anything that was big and fluffy, because that was an easy sell. And nowadays, you know, I've been to some of the marketing conferences, and zoo marketing departments are really interested in how we change that and how we start engaging audiences with different species. But I think, yeah, I think it's been a combination of people remembering what we used to do, and sort of that slow evolution, and marketing departments going for easy wins, and just yeah, the fact that we just have to carry on working really hard to kind of push engagement with those invertebrates and our research on how to engage people with those invertebrates. But yeah, I think those are the reasons why.
Okay, Cyril, have you got another question? And then we might have one more after that. So if anybody's got a burning question, raise your hand, and first one to raise their hand gets a question.
Well, we had a question at the beginning.
Yeah.
I can't remember from who, but she asked, do invertebrates such as giant African land snails used for teaching in schools and universities require a zoo license?
Not if you're in a zoo or university, because you are not open to the general public. So it's about letting the public in. So it doesn't matter if you're charging or not, but your students are not considered to be the general public. I have worked in a college zoo though, which did open to the general public, and therefore they got a zoo license to do that because they were doing that for more than 7 days a year. So no, as long as you're not like letting random people come in and watch your lessons.
So just to clarify there, Caroline, if an animal's not on display in the zoo, does it still require the zoo license?
So your zoo license, and that's a really good question. Your zoo license covers what's within your perimeter. Okay. So if it's off display, it does still need to be under the license if it's within your perimeter, but you can change your perimeter, and some zoological collections have sort of non-licensed species that are outside their perimeter. They use that, places that have things like hedgehog hospitals do that, because the healthcare management is completely different if you're running something like a hedgehog hospital. So yeah, you can get some collections that kind of make changes based on that, but no, normally it's as long as it's in perimeter.
Okay, so Alex, you raised your hand first. Do you want to turn your video on and unmute yourself? Would do, but I can't. Oh, it's fine if you don't. It's fine with the video. You should be able to ask your question now. Sorry, Alex, we're struggling to hear you there. Yeah, I can't make that out, Carol.
I can't make it out, Alex. If you type it in the chat, though, I'll pick it up from there. Hello? Oh, no worries. He's just going to stick his mic on.
Yeah, while we're waiting for that, there was somebody else who had their hand raised. We might quickly come to you. Who was it? The hand's gone down now, so I forgot the name.
There was a really good question that I spotted when I was looking at the chat earlier when we were talking about which were the primary species, that was about essentially asking about genetic drift and whether or not the long-term sort of genetic diversity was impacted, and whether they might even evolve because they've been captive populations for such a long time. And the answer is yes, the chances are that we are seeing genetic drift in our invertebrate populations in zoos. Absolutely. This has been shown in invertebrate populations already, and it would be one of the reasons why some of our invertebrate populations that we're keeping for education purposes would probably never be suitable for conservation. So if we're running a conservation program, we monitor the stud book, so we monitor the genetics very, very closely, and that's all done with lots of complicated computer programs, but also we would look to have as few generations as possible, ideally, between the founder population and the release population. So like for the fem raft spiders, for example, founder population, you know, the population that we collected was the same population that was released in the end. So absolutely great question, and it is something that we have to factor in zoos. And yes, Alex is ready to try again, I think.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah. Got you now.
Yeah, I keep forgetting that the microphone on my laptop is god awful. So I can see someone else has actually put checking out Lucas the Spider on YouTube, and I was just thinking about how I know plenty of people that are terrified of insects and terrified of spiders. Like, they won't come to my house because I keep tarantulas. And in terms of keeping lots of invertebrates in zoos, is there a way we could probably try and capitalize on some of the more acceptable invertebrates? Because all those people who hate my tarantulas and hate spiders, they all unanimously agree that Lucas the spider and jumping spiders are objectively adorable.
I mean, I agree that jumping spiders are objectively adorable. Yes, I think there is. And again, some of the work that's been done more recently in zoological collections is actively trying to work to challenge the negative perceptions. So there was that paper on anthropomorphism use in social media with uncharismatic species. And I mean, Lucas the spider is a perfect example of, you know, a lot of the time as zoo educators, we're very careful about anthropomorphism because you don't want to get people kind of treating your animals like they're people. But there is this, there's a feeling now that actually the further removed a species is from humans, probably the more effective anthropomorphism is going to be at getting people to actually like and try and protect it. So it's one of the tools that can be used. I don't think it's the only tool, and I think it's something that you have to mitigate and kind of manage very carefully. But there's things like London Zoo had their In With the Spiders exhibit a while ago, which was absolutely amazing. That was quite bold for a zoo to have an exhibit that a certain number of people would just hate you for. But I think that that kind of exhibit is really, really important in just encouraging people, you know, because they've got things like golden orb weaver spiders that are free range. So you can walk in and take a selfie with a spider right there behind you, which is absolutely brilliant in proving to people that these are not dangerous. They're not that scary. There are also several zoological collections in the UK. I've done one at one zoo I worked at, do things like arachnophobia workshops. And again, you know, we have plenty of different species that we're keeping, so that can be really, really effective. But also just this Christmas just gone, my local collection, who I volunteer for, Lakeland Wildlife Oasis, they did a Christmas trail that was based on the Eastern European Christmas story about tinsel and spiders. And it's one of the things that I think will be interesting to investigate is, you know, a lot of the time in zoos, we talk about invertebrates when it's Halloween. And that's when everyone's kind of going, oh, scary invertebrates, scary invertebrates. But part of the thing of looking at stuff like the Big Bug Bonanza in the summer is we're trying to challenge, don't just talk about invertebrates when it's negative and you're already trying to fight the opinion, talk about them at other times of year as well and look at them from different angles. And so that is one of the things we do. We use them an awful lot in schools talks as well. I've been a zoo educator for a long time, and in practice, if I didn't have an invertebrate that the kids were meeting in a schools talk, it was unusual. I would absolutely always try and get at least a hissing cockroach in, because I think, yeah, seeing them face to face and actually meeting them is amazing. It's very powerful.
On that note, Caroline, we're going to bring this session to an end, but thank you very much for a fascinating talk.